Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Black Lives Matter International Organization's endorsement of Cuba. That happened over 5 or so days ago, as of the recording of this video on July 20th, 2021. And has been a lot of outcry from both the left and the right. Many people on the right have been saying that the Black Lives Matter is ignoring the brutality that happens to people in Cuba every single day, including black and brown people, which we'll get into in a moment. And people on the left are saying, well, Cuba, this is a piece out in the Atlantic, Cuba is not the same country it was in the 80s, because the Black Lives Matter statement on Instagram made reference to Cuba's sort of protection of black revolutionaries in times when the American government wanted to arrest them. But that's not the same country it was back in the 80s. Therefore, we shouldn't hold it to the same standard. And I just sit here and I just think to myself that everyone here is missing the point. The point is not that Cuba has changed. Cuba has been predicated upon authoritarianism and state control of the human being and remaking of the human being since Castro, even before, since the days of Batista. So this is not a matter of just recent history. These are first principles which animate the essence of these regimes, and from the premise they move forward with their actions. This is nothing new. What is concerning here, my friends, is that we can arrive, or certain people can arrive at these terrible conclusions, and then assume that these terrible conclusions are indicative of the general mentality of a certain kind of people. What do I mean? Before I get into that, let me read a little bit of the statement that Black Lives Matter released on Cuba for context. The statement says, Black Lives Matter condemns the U.S. federal government's inhumane treatment of Cubans and urges it to immediately lift the economic embargo. Now, for those of you who are not historically aware, the embargo on Cuba has not been consistent. There have been several times throughout world history when that embargo has been lifted and then put back on. I mean, it was even scaled back quite recently, a few years ago. So let's not ignore the historical fact. If the embargo was the reason why Cuba is in the state that it's in, then there would have to be a sort of overarching assumption that the embargo being lifted in the past has had no effect on the conditions of Cuba, and that Cuba's conditions are tied solely to the embargo, which doesn't seem to be true. Especially since Cuba trades with several other countries, many of whom have very big GDPs and resources to offer Cuba itself, but Cuba doesn't really produce much of anything, which may be a reason as to why the country does bad. Also, the fact that Cuba's form of government is not conducive to human flourishing. It is not recognized that principle, that fiery principle of human liberty. Perhaps that's why Cuba suffers as well. So this idea the economic embargo is causing Cuba to suffer is just historically ignorant, and it's also ignorant of the conditions of Cuban people who deal with a tyrannical government every single day. It says this cruel and inhumane policy, instituted with the explicit intention of destabilizing the country and Cubans undermining rights of Cubans to choose their government, is at the heart of Cuba's current crisis. Since 1962, the United States has forced pain and suffering on the people of Cuba by cutting off food, medicine, and supplies, costing the tiny island a nation an estimated $130 billion. Again, this embargo has been lifted several times throughout Cuba's history, and Cuba is not dependent on solely the United States, and has not been dependent on solely the United States throughout its history. The Soviet Union used to give Cuba aid back then when it was still around. So they go into this idea about how COVID is the reason as to why people are upset and angry, and that's just not the case at all. And then they also say that the people of Cuba are being punished by the U.S. government because the country has maintained its commitment to sovereignty and self-determination. So, my friends, the broader point here is that Black Lives Matter, the people who run this organization, are dealing in abstractions. The material conditions of Cuba show that people are being oppressed. The internet is being blocked so information can be stifled, so information cannot start a revolution in the minds and hearts of men, because revolutions in the minds and hearts of men is what precisely causes political revolutions and forces of change to take root over certain conditions. They are ignoring all of that stuff to engage with the idea of Cuba as this sort of communistic, socialistic paradise that they can trust in. But when the empirical evidence tells you to go otherwise, when people in Cuba are shouting, "We want freedom," when they are waving the American flag, and when they, as Machiavelli said, acknowledge their ancient liberty, they cannot be stopped. How did we get to a point where an organization which is a major political force in America, which proclaims to speak for black people in America, has the ethical and social legitimacy to make such a egregiously unintellectual, unfounded statement? It's all your fault. I said it. It's all your fault. Now, I'm not talking about any individual here, but I am talking about the tendency for many people to think in terms of abstract ideas as opposed to in terms of reality, and to try to use certain organizations or certain individuals as avatars for a certain position. The ACLU has historically been seen as the home, the birthplace, the protectorate of free expression in America. So when the ACLU goes woke and begins undermining their former commitment to freedom of expression, and begins pushing ideas that are insular and actually cause for expression to be restricted and dialed back to not offend the sensibilities of certain people, folks may conceptualize that free expression in America, or the fight for it, is dead because they put all their eggs in the ACLU basket. Similarly, when Black Lives Matter is given the decision to make ethical judgments on behalf of black people, people may conceptualize that a lot of black people agree with these ideas. My friends, by outsourcing moral and ethical judgments to groups and organizations, especially those based on abstractions, moral legitimacy has been given to Black Lives Matter, and moral legitimacy is given to these organizations who make these unfounded statements. This happens all across the political spectrum. And this is what has given BLM the platform to do this. And so BLM doubled down on this and said in an email to NBC News that their statement was grounded in their unequivocal support for Cuba, and they vowed to amplify the voices of Afro-Cuban protesters protesting oppression from all actors, including the United States embargo. They said, "We unequivocally join in solidarity with the Cuban people against repression and violence from internal and unseen actors." Again, abstractions, not going into reality and observing things, just rationalizing about why they're doing things as opposed to justifying it. "We understand that anti-blackness exists within Cuba and is a global issue. We struggle alongside black people." Watch this part. "We struggle alongside black people across the diaspora for liberation and self-sovereignty." But my friends, you already have self-sovereignty. You already have the liberating mechanism within your human being that give you and bequeath you free will and allow you to be a free and rational individual. You already have these things, but BLM is using their position as the representative of the plight of black people around the world to convince people that they do not have these things, and then to take them down a road that may not serve their well-being. And this is what happens again when ethics and morality and those decisions are outsourced to granular ideas, to granular structures, and the individual is rejected at the base of them. Any kind of coherent ethics must come from an individual understanding why they are right and wrong, and from an individual engaging as to why those things are right and wrong. You cannot use these vague categories, black people, Afro-Cubans, and then presume you have all the knowledge for these people, which rejects the principle of variations, which says that we are all very different, whether it's biomedically, whether it's ideologically, and tries to make everyone a part of this one slate. You cannot have any substantive ethical foundation if you have that viewpoint. Now, outsourcing knowledge to people who actually know what they're talking about is fine. If you want to outsource your knowledge or your beliefs to a lawyer, go ahead. And you don't know law, go ahead. You want to outsource your knowledge to a doctor who knows medicine better than you, go ahead. But even in those instances, you have to have enough knowledge to decide what is best for you, what is correct, more so. But the instances of specialization in which we should outsource our knowledge to other people do not necessarily relate to the ethical determinations that we must make when dealing with very complicated world issues. My friends, Black Lives Matter was created because there is a deluge of people that do not have the ethical temerity to engage with moral issues without being a part of something larger than themselves, without realizing that the self is the vessel by which we get to moral or immoral conclusions. Grotius, natural law theorist who helped construct the political project of America through his works inadvertently. He said that there are two natural principles, self-defense, self-preservation, and everything flows from those things. But when you have these abstract categories, those two things become irrelevant. In these constructions, the good of the whole, the common good, the good for our people, whatever these broad phrases which are descriptionless mean, they become the ethical movers and shakers of that universe. We have to take authority back from those abstractions. We have to take authority back from those rationalizations. And we have to realize that true ethics, true morals rest squarely in reality. And you have the keys to access it if you really want to. And if you really want to, stop outsourcing your judgments and your moral understandings to groups and get some skin in the game and take some responsibility for your own worldview. Think on it. My friends, I love you. If you love me, patreon.com/officialcwatson, PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or you can get me on Locals, christianwatson@locals.com, or Discord, which is in the link down below. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.